It's been a little bit since I've done an introduction on a show, but this one is deserving of one because today I'm talking to Samuele Marcora. He's a researcher and physiologist. He's based out of Italy, and he's a full-time professor at the University of Bologna. And honestly, we don't get into what he's best known for until pretty deeply into the conversation. So I wanted to make sure I recorded this so people have the upfront information that they need. Sam is probably best known for creating the psychobiological model of fatigue. And in the research, a lot of it is going to be conducted on endurance monostructural activities for the most part. So just for some context for people. However, Sam has also gotten into CrossFit and been doing more investigation of that. And that's actually, he commented on one of our YouTube videos and was correcting some things that we were in error in saying, rightfully so. And I ended up, putting two and two together, figuring out exactly who he was and contacting him and having him on the show. I'm also joined by Michael FitzGerald of Optimal Performance Training, OPT, and he is someone who is really well read on all of Marcora's and frankly a lot of other people in that are kind of tightly intertwined in that space to be able to speak to that and ask really informed questions. So I appreciate Michael coming on and sort of, frankly, like doing more of the hosting than me in this episode. So big shout out to him. We are also going to have a follow-up episode, a part 2, with Sam and Michael because we don't get to all the topics that we want to today. And we also want to do it justice and making sure we get to talk about all the topics that we need to unpack this pretty dense topic. So with all that being said, let's dive in. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all one place, zorfitness.com.
Functional cross-training, to avoid calling it CrossFit, but basically undergraduate module about CrossFit in a broader sense. So I looked into... I took my level 1, I looked into CrossFit YouTube, and you and few others. Mostly it's actually quite nasty. But I appreciate your content, like, for coaches, for athletes, science-based. So I'm glad to
Hello?
be here.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we got you. You're good.
Am I here? Okay.
Hi, Mike. It's like you're all three very birdy people.
It's a pleasure to speak to you again, Sam. I spoke to you many, many years ago when you were actually at Kent University.
Yeah, I'm sure.
There you go.
I'm still an honorary position
Yeah,
there.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a pleasure to speak with you. Yeah. I've been reviewing and studying. Yeah. Anyway.
Good.
Yes.
We'll have a discussion then. I'm glad you appreciate my hour because you never do it by yourself. Our research.
Yeah, I've consumed pretty much most of, I would say definitely your most popular and most cited articles, or anywhere you're referenced, or most of the adjacent people that would discuss your model, and then the arguments, between central governor and stuff, and and reviews from Burnley and Jones, and it's great. I love that stuff so much. I felt it's been very helpful for my own coaching and CrossFit stuff.
Good. That's nice.
Yeah, Michael, maybe you want to give just a quick overview of Sam's work and what he's best known for.
Ooh, I don't. Well, Sam would probably be best to give the overview, but so.
Nobody likes talking about themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just say for me, right? So when I first got into coaching, in probably 2007, 2008, like the book is over there on my shelf. I can see it, and Sam will know when I say the name of it. It's called The Lore of Running, and it's from Tim Noakes. And I remember reading that book, and there was things in the book. He would mention things about central governor and basically talking about basically like your body, your kind of down regulating motor output to protect itself from catastrophic myocardial ischemia or any type of issue in the brain. So, and that was kind of the thought process I guess I went with for quite a while, of thinking, I guess that kind of is what it is. I guess that's why you slow down. But the more the more you read about it, the more you experience endurance sport, the more you realize that it is a conscious decision to slow down. Like, you're slowing down and you're like, man, that doesn't, and then I just started thinking, I was like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then the more you really read about the central governor stuff, the more it sounds weird, because I was rereading Ben, you may not, and you can let me know if you know who these guys are, but I'm sure Sam will. I was rereading an article by Ross Tucker last night about because that's when he added the anticipatory RPE addition to the central governor model. But I think that's a really great distinction between Sam, your work, and theirs, is even when they're talking about perception of effort, and we'll get to all that stuff and what that means, they're still talking about perception of effort as like it only references through a control center in your brain that prevents you from like having a problem. So it's all about like control and prevention, as opposed to, which I would say in your model, it's about informing the individual of how hard and heavy the activity is. And it's not like we're putting the brakes on you. And Ben, for example, if you don't know what the central governor model is, it's I may not give it the best explanation, but it's basically like an unconscious control system that prevents you from killing yourself. That's why you stop. Like, your brain basically prevents you from activating the musculature to keep working harder, and it slows you down intentionally without your conscious decision making.
Like, the idea being, if you like your brain or your heart or lungs, was so desaturated that you start damaging yourself, that it would stop you from doing that.
Yes. And then the other really big part of it from them, right, is that the heart and the legs, like the fatigue in the legs, it's what's driving RPE, right? It's a feedback system. That's what it's really saying. And that's where it's really different with Sam's model, in that that's not what's driving RPE, right? RPE being a feed-forward system through corollary discharges. And I think one of the first times I really was like, oh yeah, that's actually right. I think it was and Sam, you can correct me if I'm wrong in that, but the first one I read was about, I think it was like the Cure Air stuff, where they basically like kind of made the legs numb and have them doing the bike sprints, and they still generate a perception of effort, but it's just their pacing is all wonky.
Yeah, that's a lidocaine, actually.
Lidocaine, okay.
Or fentanyl, which
Yes.
is sadly famous, especially in the States, right? Because you can actually, instead of taking it, you can actually inject it as an anesthetic. The curare is very relevant, though, but it is different. So the curare is the Amazon people that kill the monkeys to kill them with the that's curare is in there. They take it from the yellow, red frogs, the venom, and what it does is, if I remember correct, it acts at the neuromuscular junction. I think it prevents acetylcholine to either from being released or to attach to the postsynaptic receptor, whatever. So, but anyway, it blocks the neuromuscular junction transmission. So basically paralyzes you. So it blocks the signal from reaching the muscle. And that's why if you take a high dose, that's why first of all, the monkeys fall down because they cannot grab the trees. And also they die because they can't breathe, because the breathing is through skeletal muscles. And what they did in those studies, these are the crazy colleagues in Scandinavia, by the way, because they don't let you do things like that in Italy or even UK to healthy people. So they inject very small doses, so they don't die. They can still breathe. It's just a minor. I mean, they can. I think in those studies they got 40, 50% reduction in maximal force. So and of course, when you, for example, lift a weight or cycle, you do even aerobic activity, with partially impaired neuromuscular transmission, your perception of effort goes through the roof. Why? Not because there's no change, because they're pushing the same workload. There's no difference in that study with the curare. There's no difference in the amount of feedback information that goes to the brain, but there is a big difference in the central neural drive to compensate for the neuromuscular junction impairment. So that's a way to prove that the central motor command or central neural drive is very important for perception of effort. The one you refer, you just mixed up the substance, doesn't matter, but is with the anesthetic. So in those studies, you block the signals from the legs to, or the arms, whatever, depends on the exercise you do, to the brain, which are supposed, including by the central government, but most people, if I ask most of my students, where do you think that the signal for perception of effort comes from, they will say from the body.
Yes.
So you block the signal. We actually did the meta-analysis published in Sports Medicine recently. We actually reviewed all these anesthesia studies, and there's no effect whatsoever. The only time you see a small effect if you define effort as discomfort. That's a problem, because when we do exercise, we experience a lot of sensations, not just the sensation of effort. I mean, we feel the pressure, we feel the pain, we feel the heat, the discomfort. So and those sensations are based on afferent feedback. For example, the burning, aching sensation when you do, especially intense exercise like CrossFit, that's afferent feedback. Those are signals primarily stimulated by metabolites or changes in potassium, sodium, and stuff that excites these receptors in the muscle and sends signals to the brain, and you feel the burning, the aching sensation. So if you take this anesthetic, you don't feel any pain in the legs, which is great, but you still feel effort. And effort is certainly in normal condition, of course. I mean, if you break a leg during an ultra-endurance event or an ankle, I'm sure you're not going to run very much. So in that case, becomes a limiting factor. But when I talk about exercise-induced muscle pain or even soreness, those are intense, are annoying, but we did actually study. They don't reach the level that you would give up because of that pain. You give up because the perception of effort fools you into believing that you're not capable of doing what you're doing. At least in endurance exercise, I think later maybe we need to distinguish, because obviously CrossFit is complex. It's not just endurance exercise. There is the more muscle fatigue, which I think it's very important to distinguish. So yeah, so that's a big difference between my model, but that's maybe it's a bit academic. I know it's important to
yeah, I think that was the one question. One thing I wanted you to mention, just because a lot of coaches, I think they really don't disconnect those two things. They don't disconnect exercise-induced muscle pain from perception of effort, and just like a very quick explanation of like these are two different neurophysiology signals. Then they kind of go, oh, okay, now I get it. Because you explain it that like you just said, it comes from the muscle. Pain is going into the brain, and like it's coming from the muscles due to the 3 and 4 afferents, I think. And then the brain is generating its own perception of effort based on the signals being sent out, right? So the corollary discharges, which is just a nice. It's just a very nice, easy way to explain it. And then I think once you do that, then you can actually start honing in on what you're actually talking about, because people still think of discomfort, they think of pain, and that's what's making them stop. But I'm sure you would probably say like it has some impact of how you're interpreting your perception of effort. But that's not the main cause of it. And kind of like, I guess on that example, like when they, because there was a different version of that, like reducing pain and then changing pacing behavior, right, by, I think it was Alexis Mauger.
Was a colleague of mine in Kent.
Yeah, he did lots of great research on pain stuff. And he was basically trying to, or this article I'm thinking, I was trying to suggest that, like, you reduce pain sensation through acetaminophen, and then it changes the pacing behavior of the individual, and then trying to use that as an argument of like pain is what kind of modulates it. But if you look at it, the RPE experienced by the individuals was higher as well, I believe, because they were working harder, I think. And yet,
so but actually pain, I think it's important. First of all, one thing that any coach can do this experiment to find out that there are two different things. So, I don't know how popular they are these days in the US, but this blood flow restriction kind of cuff that you can, or you just take a blood pressure cuff, you put it around your arm, you're going to stop the circulation, you're going to feel the burn in the aching. Very similar, slightly different, but similar mechanism. But you wouldn't feel any, if you're not voluntarily contracted the muscle, you wouldn't feel any effort. Why? You feel the pain, but you're not sending any signal to the muscle, voluntarily contracted the muscle, you don't feel any burning sensation. So that's easy to disconnect. However, perception of effort, like any sensation, including pain, doesn't depend only, and I think this is super important also for practice. Of course, the intensity of the signal, either central drive for effort or the signal from the muscles in case of pain, are very important determinants of how intense you feel that sensation. However, then before it becomes a sensation, it's processed by the brain at the biological level, but then also neurocognitive level. So, for example, if I give you the same painful stimuli every day, so the signal that reaches your brain is the same. But some days, for example, if you're in a good mood, you're going to feel less pain than in another day that you're in a bad mood. So the intensity of the sensation, any sensation, but let's say pain and effort, depends not only how intense is the signal, but also how your brain and also yourself psychologically interpret that signal. So, of course, you can do things, maybe we discussed that in training, to reduce the intensity of the signal so that you perceive less effort or less pain, depending on what we're talking about. But you can also, for example, reduce perception of effort and improve your performance independently of doing the things such as training. That's the best way to reduce perception of effort is training. And we know that, although we cannot overlook it because it's too obvious.
Yeah, it's so obvious.
But the good thing is that if perception of effort was just an epiphenomenon, as it is in the central governor, also in the muscle fatigue model. So muscle fatigue, people thought, okay, muscle fatigue is important, so it's decline, exercise-induced decline in force or power that is important. The perception of effort is just an epiphenomenon of that. Or in the case of the central governor, perception of effort is the epiphenomenon of the calculations of the brain that anticipates when you need to stop and generate. So regardless of the mechanism, it's not the real mechanism that makes you stop. In my model, it is. And the good thing is that, of course, you can, for example, reduce perception of effort, improve your performance by training, or by anything that improves your periphery. Because, of course, if your muscle, also want to talk about ventilation, respiration later. But if you concentrate on the muscle, if your muscle is stronger and more resistant to fatigue, muscle fatigue, so it becomes the weakening of the muscle over time is less. Of course, you're going to need less drive to produce the same force. So you're going to have, for the same work, you're going to have less effort, or vice versa, for the same effort, so the same drive, you're going to get more output. So that's easy to understand. You change the periphery, and this it will have an indirect effect on your perception of effort because you need to. However, you can also change things directly in your brain, feel less effort, and improve your performance on the top of what you do in training. And I think that's what makes it attractive, because it just doesn't explain the effects of training, for example, in a different way, in a psychobiological way, but also gives you some new strategies to improve performance. The central governor, it wouldn't work because it's a subconscious thing that how can you change it?
Yeah.
That
psychological interventions don't work if that's true, right?
Exactly.
Because it's already like predetermined. There's like no free will to it.
Yeah. At least in the original model, then of course, as often happens, they change the model. Now everything goes, but
I guess the one question I would have for you then, just kind of to circle back before we get going, is because I'm and again at the time, you have the peripheral idea of performance being like it's all limited by what's going on inside the muscle with phosphocreatine increase, like inorganic phosphate, pH, etc. And then along comes like, Tim Noakes, which, again, obviously very, very great idea to be like, maybe it's not just the muscles, maybe the brain is probably involved in this. And then so you have those two models, but like for yourself, how did you come to think like maybe it's not either one of those two things, maybe it's something else? Like where was your aha moment or your insight that maybe we're missing something here? Because the real difference to me, which I love, is because it's the connection with the potential motivation and the motivational intensity. That's what really made it make sense, because you can just watch it in people and just like see them. Anyway, sorry, but that's what I was curious about.
It's very simple actually. So my PhD was in clinical exercise physiology. It was about treating muscle atrophy in a patient with rheumatoid arthritis. So I was with high-intensity weight training, which is fun in people with all joints aching, but also nutritional supplements, even anti-catabolic drugs that were the 3 studies of my PhD, try to prevent this muscle loss, which of course is good, for the fun. But what I noticed, because I actually trained them, right, in the gym, is that one of the things that was bothering them the most was what they call fatigue. But it wasn't muscle fatigue, the kind of fatigue that we study in exercise physiology. It was perceived fatigue. And it was very disabling. So it was very affecting the behavior. And also was very interesting. Okay, there is some level of chronic fatigue, but some days is high, some days is low. Things that change quickly are not about fitness, or they're about the central nervous system. Fitness in the muscles, but depends what you're measuring. In the best scenario is weeks, to improve, to change muscle function with the metabolic, for muscle mass is even more. So it doesn't change day to day. It's not one day you feel so tired and some people cannot even get off the bed, and some days you feel much better. That's a central nervous system. So the two things that then became my interest. So first of all, there's the perceived fatigue that can be disabling, not just, and it must be from the central nervous system because of this speed of change that cannot be explained in a muscular or cardiovascular way, the traditional way. Then, of course, something to do with the brain, I read the work, which was the only work really in exercise and sports science related to fatigue and the brain at that time. So I have to say, although I disagree on many things, but certainly Professor Noakes had the merit of, starting to put some doubts into people that cannot be only peripheral. Although again, in sport exercise physiology community, in other community, the perceived fatigue, because in clinical settings, is very much more appreciated. But I couldn't. There were so many things that contradict the model. For example, the original model was big about preventing myocardial ischemia, because one of the ways that he said you can damage yourself with exercise to increase the metabolic requirements, the oxygen requirements of your heart, so much that it doesn't get enough from the coronary circulation, which is the circulation of the heart. So that you need to stop exercise to avoid this myocardial ischemia. There are millions of people, literally, that experience exercise-induced myocardial ischemia every day. So if you have, the angina is a symptom, but you can even have it without angina. So, for example, if you go to you do a stress test, you can see the ST7 depression ECG, and you see even before a lot of people, even before they feel the angina is the chest pain. Just for the people that I'm sure you guys know about this, for the listeners. is a kind of symptoms of pain and that you have also when you have an heart attack, but in this case, it's just induced by SSI. So you have an obstructed coronary, so there's not enough. So at rest or during light activities is enough, and there's no ischemia. But when you increase the requirements of the oxygen requirements of the heart because you do exercise, the blood that gets there is not enough because it's obstructed by these cholesterol plaques. And so so I talked to some of these people, the center governor proponents, yeah, but the model is about healthy people. These are people which are unhealthy. And then, so I just melt the BS because these people, there must maybe some people, but most of these people, the problem is not in the central nervous system. So the central nervous system is the brain is not damaged. It's a coronary circulation that is damaged. So why is not the central governor system sensing in advance that are getting close to ischemia and they recruit the leg muscle? For example, if let's say an old person going up the stairs and he feels the chest pain, why is not stopping them in advance? And this happens. So yeah, it's not even a natural experiment that happens all the time. Another one, maybe more relevant to, well, it's kind of sad because I guess in CrossFit last year, but is heat exhaustion. The only way you can kill yourself with exercise if you're healthy, that I know is by heat exhaustion. Most people don't die because, but you can die of heat exhaustion. So why is not slowing you down before you have heat illness? Again, these are a lot of people that experience this kind of. But why? Because the control is not subconscious that directly have access to your leg muscle recruitment. It's conscious. And why do people? The only way to kill yourself is by heat exhaustion because the homeostasis of your temperature, unlike other things, for example, the oxygenation of my heart is controlled completely autonomically or even locally. To be honest, there's a lot of local control. There's nothing I can do to prevent or induce myocardial ischemia, unless. But temperature regulation, it depends a lot, not only on physiological regulation, which is completely subconscious, but we're talking about the autonomic nervous system, but it depends on your behavior. That's why. So, for example, if the reason why you die of heat exhaustion is because who wouldn't run a marathon in the heat? Who would go out and run if there was no competitive goal or training goal? Nobody would do it. Why? Because it's too uncomfortable. You feel hot, and that motivates you not to do that. Maybe you go in the evening when it's fresher, or just you don't do it. The problem is that, of course, if there is a competition, you have another goal. So the goal of winning or finishing the marathon, whatever it is your goal, compete with the goal of reducing the thermal discomfort, which is the conscious way the brain motivates you, in that case, to stop. But you have another motive that motivates you to keep going, and therefore you keep going. You ignore the signals that your body is telling you, stop, this is not good. And of course, in some cases, your physiological regulation doesn't keep up and you can develop heat exhaustion and die. Why? Basically, it's a motivational explanation. That has physiological consequences, but it's a motivational, a conflict between two different motives. So it's very different in terms of the neurophysiology, but also in terms of how the perception of effort influence your behavior and for an athlete, the performance.
Yeah, Sam, and on that exact point you said of like the conflicting motives, Ben, you probably would understand this with coaching people, right? Is that I'm not sure if I said this to you last time or to someone else, but that's one of the hardest things to have with athletes is if they have to do less, is to have them consciously ignore their motive to want to do more. And to go, no, you need to tone it down and do less because you're actually getting a little too tired. But these people are so willing to act that they do not want to stop. And that's that's a non-threatening version of it. But the example Sam gave was obviously the threatening version of when you have people in those scenarios, they will work themselves to death. And I believe that's what, like in Alex Hutchinson's book, I believe he used a few examples to that. And those were the scenarios where the person was so motivated to like make a football team or to finish a race, they literally died. Yeah, and
which I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword of CrossFit in a fitness setting. So obviously, I mean, the group, the leaderboard, the group environment. I do very low-level CrossFit in my garage and with my wife. So, and actually, she doesn't like that. She calls it torture. I don't want to do torture. She does. She's Chinese, my wife. She does kind of more bodybuilding kind of thing. But
that's funny.
I tried a few times to do CrossFit with her. No, torture. I don't like. But obviously, the group thing, having a performance goal, is very powerful for motivation, especially for people that don't have enough.
Yeah.
Because especially for fitness purposes, motivating people is the problem. But of course, it can also motivate people to go a little bit too intense, do movement that maybe they're not ready to. So that's where the coach is super important, right? Also in a normal class setting in CrossFit.
Like, two things, like one, for whatever reason, like CrossFit seems to really be an issue for a lot of people thermogenically. Like they just get into hot water, well, literally hot, like really quickly. I don't know if that's because of just all the, various contractions and a lot of being.
It's the intensity, Ben.
Yeah, like so much work is being done unsustainably, and not just in like one muscle group. Like you might, like for example, if you were just cycling, you're just gonna get that in like the legs. Whereas like in CrossFit, like you might do that and then you're gonna get off and do like handstand push-ups until you can't do those anymore, and then you go to something else and you just keep kind of circulating around.
Yeah, that's and but by the way, it's something, because we talk about circulating. I like to say to my students, because I teach kind of CrossFit, I call it functional cross training. Because to avoid any trademark problems. But also, I teach in a broader way. But I used to say that I did CrossFit in middle school because in Europe, at least, because also equipment limitation stuff. So conditioning, we did a lot in school doing physical education classes. We did a lot of circuit training, which is a bit different because you go from station to station. You don't do it as a group on the spot yourself, but it's the same thing. So you do kind of more localized, and then you go from an exercise to another. So for me, CrossFit is a modern version of circuit training that I was doing I'm old guys, so I'm talking about 70s, 80s. So yeah.
So while we were talking about that, I think, again, just another thing before we move on, because I think perception of effort, you've covered what that is, what the difference is, and what it's not. Another thing that people really, I think, misunderstand is what is motivation.
Mm.
They if just I'm not looking for a real like a really clear one, but maybe what isn't it?
Yeah, motivation is a very broad category in psychology, like cognition or emotion. It's massive, okay, or perception. It's massive. Most studies applied to motivation applied to exercise are about what are the motives, why people do physical activity? Okay, is it for fitness? Is it for body image? Is it for social participation? For identity, which is both the social thing and the identity, I think, is very strong in CrossFit. So, or about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So basically, are the kind of what motives or the quality of motivation. Potential motivation, which is part of the theory on which that my model is partially based.
And for people who don't know, that the name of the model is the psychobiological model. I don't know if we've mentioned that yet.
Yeah, I call it, because I think that the performance I talk about endurance performance, then we get into the more localized things. I think that's important. But for endurance performance, you can, I call it psychological model because it can explain at the first level psychologically. I don't need any physiological variable to explain performance, which is quite, especially for my physiology colleagues. I come from physiology myself.
Yeah.
It's very, The physiology is at a lower level, lower not because it's less important, but it's to explain the physiology of the psychological constructs such as perception of effort that change at a psychological level. So they're not a combination of things. There are two separate levels of explanation. And at the level of explanation, perception of effort is certainly the most important. The other one is potential motivation. I think it's primarily important for training, not so much for competition, because potential motivation is the maximal effort is about the quantity of motivation, not about the quality. It doesn't care about what motivates you. It's about how much effort you're willing to exert in order to succeed in the task. For example, in the competition, if that's the way to achieve your goal. Let's say your goal is to feel good about yourself, beat somebody else, make money, whatever. It doesn't matter. It matters how much effort these factors justify. And to be honest, for most athletes in an important competition, they're all willing to give a maximal effort. I don't think there is no way. The difference is the relationship between effort and output, because that's very important. Perception of effort, you shouldn't consider just effort, the perception by itself. It's called a psychophysical concept. So you have always to put in relation the physical world, the physical stimuli with the perception. So you need to put perception in relation to your, let's say, power output. So the mechanic, what you're actually doing. And so is the ratio between the power output and the perception that's going to make you. I can be super. If you tell me, Sam, I give you $2 million if you run the marathon in less than 2 hours, my motivation is going to be super high, right? But I won't even begin to do it because I know that even my maximal effort is not going to give me, because I can't do that. So it's because when I run at 21 kilometers per hour, which is 15 miles per hour, something like that, 14 miles per hour. My perception of effort is from 0 to 10 is 10 after 15 seconds. So I'm not going to last 2 hours. So but for Kipchoge, by the way, I was in Monza where he tried the first time to go under 2 hours and he missed it just a little bit. And apart from the last lap, he was running. It looked like it was flying, doing nothing. So Kipchoge, after 10 seconds, he probably feels 0 to 10, probably feels free at that speed. And that's why he does it and I don't. So it's not so much the motivation, it's the perception of effort. Well, motivation, of course, can change and sometimes be too low or too high, but that's where you have to modulate the coach is during training. Because one factor that determines potential motivation is how distant is the behavior to your to the reward. So it's more difficult to motivate people to train now to reap a reward later, because that reduces the amount of motivation that they have. And maybe for an athlete is because they have maybe near competitions. But if you want to, for example, a lot of people think the motivating. I always hear this CrossFit people. When you're old, you are able to play with your child. Or even the health message. I mean, they're important. I'm not saying they're not, but because they're very deep, you have to train now. You have to make effort now, but the reward is going to be later on in life. So to motivate people, I'm talking about everyday people, general population, with distant goals is not very good. So it's not as good as people think because of this discount. It's called the UN. So. If the potential motivation is low, of course, you're not going to put much effort in your training, for example. But I think with CrossFit, this is not maybe a big problem, right? Maybe the problem is the other way around. People are willing to exert effort, and sometimes they do too much. They do too much.
Like, there's a couple ways that you would notice it. Well, Ben, you can go first because I have lots to talk about.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, okay, Kipchoge's running and he's maximally motivated, but maybe until the lap he realizes where he can't do it. And then if he actually does finish out the marathon, I'm sure like the time he didn't do it, like he probably really dropped off the pace once he realized he couldn't sustain it anymore. And that
that's
also
not
might
due
go
to
for
motivation.
like,
That's
yeah.
not due to a lot of people. I guess it's one of the problems with, there is a bit of a misunderstanding of my model. It's the fault of Matt FitzGerald. They wrote How Bad Do You Want It,
Yes.
which is one of the first books that cover a lot of my research. I mean, great guy. It's a great title as well.
It is great.
But it's not how bad do you want
No,
it.
it's not.
Everybody wants it badly.
Yeah.
The difference is really in the perception of effort, in the relation with output. So that's where you really need to work. I think motivation becomes it's more of an issue with the general population for long-term adherence to training. But with athletes, it's not what the difference between a good athlete and a bad athlete, or winning or losing, is not how bad they want it. Is their perception of effort.
Yeah, I would like that's what I was saying. Like it's more common to have to slow people down in terms of athletics, to have to tell them to take a break and tone it down versus having to really tell them to rev it up in terms of training. The two examples I would say where it's lacking, right, is like, so if you watch a competition, especially if you watch at the CrossFit Games, if like you could watch 3 or 4 days in a row, but by the last day, the first heat, so the people in the lowest standings are quite obviously the least motivated people. When you watch them perform, they're almost performing below their capabilities, except unless it's like an event where someone in that heat could win and therefore win some money. If they're like, oh, I think I could beat everybody on this, so they're just going to like destroy it, and then everyone else in their heat is really slow because they're basically like out of it. And you would see that in sports too. I think another example would be, which is very common in CrossFit, and we'll get to, but I just want to explain this. So another side of physiology, obviously, Ben, I believe you're familiar with this in terms of like critical power and work prime, the power duration stuff. And obviously it's very popular, or it's very well studied in terms of monostructural activity, right? Rowing and running and stuff. But like obviously as a practitioner, you watch this and you have people do like, a 3-minute test, a 15-minute test on like a row, for example, to try to calculate critical power and work prime type stuff. But these are like, again, in the literature when they read it, right, they assume that the individuals are giving maximum effort. But I guess to Sam's point is like, yeah, you're assuming these people are truly giving their actual best, and like that's just like an aside of an assumption, like, oh, that we asked them, they said it was 10 out of 10, and that's it, right? And those are the calculations you're using, right? And those calculations are built in for then the prediction models of the work prime and like Philip Skiba's W prime balance model. But if you just go back to the basics of like, okay, well, I asked them to do this 3-minute test, and we knew they were maximally motivated because we told them to be. You're like, well, I mean, like regular people doing these tests, like regular people doing a 3-minute all-out test, you're like they're not, even though they do familiarization stuff, I still think people.
No, but there's no way you can do a true maximal effort for 3 minutes. I mean, they did studies, and it looks like beyond 30 seconds, people start to pace themselves.
That's what I mean.
Even if you tell them, and even if they think that they went all out, they don't. There is some nice little study about that.
Yeah.
Actually, there is even something that can resonate with CrossFit people. So they did a study where they did the critical power calculations, and they did it either with time to exhaustion test, or time trials.
Yeah.
And they found that with time trials is a bit higher, because it's not exactly the same thing with time to exhaustion. It's a little bit like for time or AMRAP. Normally, for time is a bit more. They tend to perform a little bit. It's a bit more motivational than AMRAP.
Yes.
Okay. So that's a similar thing with time to exhaustion, and for time. You don't. For time gives you a bit clearer goal. I don't know. It's more motivational. So if it was a fixed physiological thing, you shouldn't really change if it was done by time to exhaust or time trial by does. So no, there is in exercise physiology, it's changing a little bit, I guess. Also,
so
some of my work, but
the reason I mentioned that because like obviously, I believe it was Andy Vanatello and Mark Burnley that popularized the 3-minute bike test. And Mark and again, like towards the like in their model,
he's a good friend, by the way. I know him very well.
Mark, him and Andrew Jones are again two of my favorite researchers. I love their stuff. So again, in that test, that 3-minute test, you get towards the end, you're assuming is a max effort. And again, like there is some disagreement of like, was that a max effort? Is it like, what's the main limitation for pacing? What's happening? But obviously Mark Burnley subsequently did lots of other work when he started getting into critical torque. And I remember reading his review in 2018, and I actually wrote down the sentence because in one of the reviews, he gets to the end of it, and he's talking about power duration, the power duration model, and going through the different intensity domains and talking about fatigue and what causes it. And there's the last section he's talking about what causes you to slow down or what causes you to stop. And he briefly mentions central governor model, and then he mentions the sensory tolerance limit, and then he starts talking about your model. But then the one example they use, which is more along where we want to talk about CrossFit, I think, right, is they get to like knee extensor torque after the 5-minute critical torque test reaches critical torque, and then it starts trailing off. And they're saying that like people didn't disengage from the task even though they fell below the target torque. So they didn't disengage even once like task failure occurred. He's saying that they disengaged because they couldn't physically do it anymore. So that was their argument to where like perception of effort wasn't modulating task failure in that sense. So I think that gets us closer to talking about like what's going on in CrossFit potentially.
Yeah, and I think maybe just a really obvious example of this would be like if you ask somebody to do just like a normal person, do a 5K row time trial and 2 minutes max push-ups. Like a lot more people are going to reach their full potential on 2 minutes max push-ups than the 5K time trial. Kind of for that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think there is a big divide where we put exactly the debatable, but it's the intensity of the contraction. Because a lot of people, the problem is that when we talk about isolated kind of muscle thing, we normalize the intensity by the LBC. When we talk about like this monostrap, it sounds weird, but anyway, aerobic activity, what we're talking about is the percent VO2 max. And people think, it's all to 100%. No. From a neuromuscular point of view, a VO2 max test is, depends. At best, 30% of your, is really low. I'm not talking about maximal VO2 max, the power at VO2 max. So it's very high intense.
You're talking about the power output in the quadriceps, like at the end of a ramp test on a cyclometer type thing. It's like, it's still very low.
Exactly. Yes. So it's, put it this way. So if I would probably put it, I think it's conservative, by the way. I think it's actually be higher. But let's say 50% of your muscle I'm talking about. So you never reach that with an endurance. Never. But of course you do with the push-up, pull-ups, of course, heavy load, the kind of loads, with the weights and stuff. So above 50%, then it's, let's say, I think it's higher than that. But let's be conservative. You can actually reach the limit of your muscle, because muscles can lose, I think it's less, but let's say 60% of their maximal power because of muscle fatigue. So you can actually reach the point, for example, if I'm doing pull-ups, and the effort goes the same way, but I'm going to reach a point where my muscles are failing. I also feel a maximal effort, but my muscles are failing. The reason why perception of effort becomes more important with lower level relative muscle contraction, which is the muscle contraction that we use for aerobic activities, is because perception of effort is not just related to the intensity, relative intensity of the effort that you're doing, also to time. So over time, if you keep the same output, I mean, everybody knows, I mean, you go out for a run, let's say 5K, same speed, let's say you're perfect pacing, even pacing, you're the best pace in the world, and you start with the same speed that you have at the end, okay? At the end, it feels much harder than at the beginning, the perception of effort, right? Everybody knows that. Why? Because even if you're doing the same thing, because of this time effect of on perception of effort. So the lower the relative intensity of the muscle contraction and the longer the time or the numbers of muscle contractions, the more dissociation there is between the perception and what you're actually doing. So the smaller the number of the contraction and therefore the higher the load, the more closer the two are, all right? So that's to explain in a simple way why perception of effort really becomes the limiting factor in kind of more prolonged activity, like endurance activity, and real muscle failure becomes more of an important in gymnastic or weightlifting kind of things.
Yeah, like one of the ways again I've tried to explain this to people, and again you can tell me if you see it differently, but because you mentioned it earlier when you were talking about working with people with rheumatoid arthritis, right? And that you used the word perceived fatigue, right? And that's the language that like Roger Inoka would use with perceived fatigability, performance fatigability, which I really like that like continuum type thing. He's like, because he used examples, I think mostly with people with multiple sclerosis, to provide the example of fatigue as a symptom. And he's like, people are sitting on the couch and they would have a very high sense of fatigue and a very high sense of effort. He's like, they're not doing anything. Like they're not moving, but they have a very high sense of fatigue.
We need to clarify that.
Yeah.
Also because it can have practical implications. So people use the term fatigue, also included in all, sometimes in very broad ways. So you can feel exhausted, tired doing that. Now, for example, I had a very long day at work. Now I'm doing something, but even before I was resting, I felt tired. I didn't feel any effort. I was doing nothing at all. So no effort because I wasn't contracting my muscle voluntarily. But you have this feeling of fatigue. But that's a dimension of what we call mood. It's a mood dimension. This feeling of lack of energy. And of course, you can feel the opposite. You can feel full of energy, full of pep, vigor, we call it. But that's a mood, a feeling. It's a subjective feeling, very important, but and that can be experienced at rest as well. Fatigue, when you're doing something, for me, perceived fatigue is this increase over time, is when the perception of effort is higher than you have when you're not fatigued. So, for example, at the end of a 5K compared to the beginning of a 5K, for the same thing you're doing, the perception of effort is higher. If you are at the chemotherapy session, before the chemotherapy, I actually did a study to publish that. Your perception, you prepare a meal for your kids, and it doesn't feel very effortful. After the chemotherapy, you cannot even do it. It feels so effortful. So is the relationship between what you're doing and the perception of effort. But that's something that appears only when you do something. So there are two different kinds of, and they can be related, but not always. Yeah. So it's and both can be used to assess, for example, whether your athletes is getting into overtraining or non-functional overreach.
Yeah, and then then go to the other side, the other side where they differentiate what they would consider more performance fatigue related things. Okay. And that's where they're suggesting the fatigue is really related to what you were saying. Like the pull-up is just the contractile strength of the muscle is literally at its maximum, and that's why the performance is stopping or slowing down, versus what you're saying, run 21 kilometers. That's not the same contractile limitation. And then so I guess maybe just from your experience in CrossFit, how do you see the use of and I don't mean from like a theoretical standpoint, like how would you see the use of perception of effort, RPE, and guiding athletes through events where, like, a 5K row, you have this fixed pace sort of thing, right? And the goal is to not disengage from the task for the whole time and just get the best time. Whereas in most CrossFit events, you have to purposefully and intelligently disengage from the task at different times to manage and optimize the overall pace throughout the event. And so, like, there's a lot that goes into that, but just in terms of the RPE aspect, I'm just curious how you may see, like, an athlete make their way through that.
So, I mean, pacing is difficult even in standard endurance event.
Yes.
And in CrossFit, I think that's why a lot of improvement in performance has been done by improving pacing, thanks to good coaches like you, compared to just go all out and it's very difficult. I think CrossFit is more difficult. However, it is important that, especially when you do these mixed modality things, that when you do this kind of more gymnastic or weightlifting where the limit may be muscular, still the perception of effort correlates with
tracks.
That.
It tracks. Yeah,
tracks with that. So I think perception of effort can be very useful to gauge, to help people to pace themselves. Another thing, which is there is a little work on, for example, a colleague of mine at the University of Rome has done some. Apparently, we also have, which I think is very important for CrossFit, because with CrossFit, right? I mean, other AMRAP or 4 times, it doesn't matter. I mean, you want to get the optimal speed, especially, there's some things that you cannot, if you slow down, that you lose a lot of time or work that you can do. Is the perception of the contraction or the velocity of movement. So, and in some cases seems to be, of course there are monitors, right, that you can measure, but people can be taught how to become better at judging the speed of their movement, which I think for CrossFit, especially for those movements where the limitation can be muscle, because we always think about muscle fatigue more in terms of reduction in maximal force, because a lot of times we measure it isometrically, but that's not so relevant for CrossFit, right? It reduces your power output, so it reduces your force, also you reduce the speed of contraction. So the speed of contraction is a very good way to gauge how close you are, together also with RP as well, but to gauge the how close you are to failure. But in the case of CrossFit, it could be a very important variable, really to pace yourself and obtain on average the best combination between stopping or continuing and to get the best output at the end of the workout.
Michael, I feel like your brother talked on that, where he maybe this is my interpretation of what he said, but basically like making dynamic contractions aerobic, and that's, in my mind, one of the things that's really changed in CrossFit in the last decade for athletes. It's just like they're more efficient at everything and it's more sustainable. But again, the way I would word is that it's less unsustainable. It's not more sustainable. Yeah. Every time you pick up a front squat, it's unsustainable. It looks more sustainable.
It just becomes, what Sam was saying originally, right? Is like if you did a 20-minute AMRAP of like 10 thrusters, 10 burpees 10 years ago, and you got 10 rounds, and you did it now, and you just mimicked your exact score from 10 years ago, your RPE is going to be much lower through the whole 20 minutes and to get 10 rounds. So your perception of effort is lower at the exact same work output as it was 10 years ago. But like that doesn't mean the thrusters themselves are sustainable, because they're not, right? They're less unsustainable. So in terms of critical power work, it'd be like you were asked to bike at 200 watts and your critical power was 195, but now you're asked to bike at 200 watts and your critical power is 240. You're like, yeah, 200's not hard. Like, I could do this all day now, because it's just changed in relevance to where the level of sustainability is. But what you were mentioning, Sam, about like that's a really noticeable thing individuals use, athletes use in CrossFit with regards to especially gymnastics and weightlifting stuff, is the speed of the contraction or the lockout. So like when they notice that like a deadlift getting like slow to lift, or the front squat's getting a little slower than normal to stand up, or like locking out the arms on a handstand push-up begins to slow down, that's their sign. Or we try to tell them that's their sign that they have to disengage. You got to slow it down, because you're gonna get that RPE to 10, and you don't want that right now because you're only halfway. And yeah, that's one like great example that athletes pick up, or they should pick up, or coaches would then have to teach them that's something the way you have to judge the pacing in this event.
Yeah. One thing I would like to say, because it's also relevant to the whole thing, we discussed a lot the RP in relation to the muscles that perform the activity, right? However, also some of the work I've done with some colleagues in Rome, super important, and that's also when you do mixed modality, even if the localized muscle fatigue is breathing.
Yeah.
When perception of effort, global perception of effort, it's not just about the perception of effort, of the effort that you do with the muscle that perform the movement. It also includes the
respiratory muscles.
Effort. Yeah, because the respiratory muscle that get we perceive a calorie discharge of the signal sent. It's exactly the same mechanism, but we perceive the calorie discharge of the signal sent to the muscle. Of course, the signal sent to the muscle, a lot of can be also voluntary, but a lot of them are involuntary, but we still perceive them, calorie discharge from them, so this respiratory effort contributes a lot to the feeling of global effort that then people use to pace themselves, or in the case of endurance, kind of limit. And because a lot of people in CrossFit, they keep talking about heart rate. I mean, nobody, unless you're a heart rate monitor, that's why we have heart rate monitors, you don't feel your bloody heart rate. But what you feel is your breathing. And it seems actually, it's interesting that the variable, the breathing is not so much, of course, ventilation, tidal volume, but the variable that most correlates with perception of effort, the breathing variable, is respiratory rate, the frequency, breathing frequency. And it's very difficult to work on it. And, I haven't done work on that, but if somebody finds a way to have efficient ventilation, but at a lower breathing frequency, you're going to reduce your effort, improve your performance a lot. The problem is that if you do it voluntarily, because we haven't talked about mental fatigue yet. I don't know if we have time, otherwise we can do another podcast. Because we're talking about muscle fatigue a lot, and now we are talking about breathing. And of course, breathing, for example, it's highly associated with the pH, the metabolic acidosis that you can develop during intense workouts like CrossFit. And so it's going to be a big, the thing is also, you also feel it when you stop. And it's going to afford, for instance, if you're breathing very hard when you stop, your perception of effort while you're stop is higher, and your decision, when I do start again, when I, what kind of work I'm going to do next, is going to be influenced by how you feel also in the breaks. And in the breaks is the breathing frequency that makes you feel the effort. So if somebody can reduce the feeling of breathing effort during cross, of course, you do it with training, but if you find some other ways to do that on the top of the training, that would improve performance a lot. And maybe with some breathing exercises, try to reduce this perception of breathing.
I think when athletes get way more comfortable sustaining a high respiration rate in CrossFit, they usually have more success. And then also, like, for beginners, that's usually what they say is like, oh, my heart rate's out of control. It's like, I highly doubt that it's that high. Like, you're not running into your max heart rate. It's like also, you feel like you're breathing super elevated, and that's what's like and oftentimes too, it's like the bracing is on top of that. So like they're doing things that require more tension, and then during the rest periods they're hyperventilating, and that's also raising their perception of effort.
Exactly. So I think I want to really to say this about the breathing, because I think in CrossFit is super important at any point. Endurance activity.
I want to be respectful of your guys' time, so we can wrap it up here shortly. I don't know if Sam, certainly if you want to revisit this a week, we can talk again sometime. But we can.
I'd love.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything
that.
else
That'd
you want to talk. Yeah, is there anything else you want to bring up before we wrap things up?
No, really. I think there is time maybe for another podcast about mental fatigue and maybe some of the psychological strategies that you can use to improve performance. Because of course, training, also nutrition, for example, a lot of people, the carbohydrates, which I think is a touchy, not for the athletes, but for Glassman, I guess, touchy topic.
And Noakes, and Tim Noakes.
And now, yeah, don't start with that. But for example, a lot of people thought that carbohydrates are used from an energetic point of view. But actually, it's very interesting. Is the when your glycogen is low, which is especially during CrossFit, when you do a lot of repeated. So when your glycogen is the limit is not the energy rate, although of course it contributes. But it seems that when your glycogen is low, your excitation contraction coupling, so the coupling between the recruitment and what comes out of your muscle, is reduced. So the ending of the calcium that initiate the contraction, because if you actually see where the glycogen is stored, is very close to the triad. So for people that don't know, is where the calcium is contained, and when it's released and gets sold for the muscle. So it has a structural role, and when it's low, it's impaired, and therefore, for example, if it's low, your excitation contraction is impaired, and you have to produce the same force, you have to increase neural drive, and that will increase your perception of effort. So things like training, but also nutrition, can affect, and that do affect perception of effort and improve your performance. But what I would like to say maybe for the next time is that on the top of that, there is the mental fatigue you need to be aware of, and to reduce it as much as possible, because that can also increase your perception of effort. And also you can use psychological strategies or nutritional strategies, cutting, for example, to reduce your perception of effort on the top of what you do with your training, with your regular nutrition.
The one thing I'll add in here, just so we can bookmark it for next time, is to ask you about the one which I don't want you to get into it, but because I remember I saw a couple of commentary papers like chastising you for it, was about the sleep deprivation study to try to improve ultra performance or like multi-day events. Because I have an individuals doing that, and I thought that was really great research to do.
That was only a pilot.
But I just saw that. I think I can't remember who was the response. Was it Malay that was very?
Yeah. Again, another. You know what? I'm friend with all these people. I have big arguments with.
That's good.
By the way, actually, I was with him just before Christmas in Germany. A great guy. Well, I think the response. I think he didn't think he wrote too early that night. No, but the idea is that maybe you can. Which we can get into it next time.
Let's just do that
next time. There are probably
That's
ways to train your brain on the top of your mind. I mean, when you do any training, I think you train your body and your brain.
Yes.
But there may be ways, such as this kind of strategic sleep deprivation bouts, but that's mainly for the ultra-endurance people or the military, the main work, or adding cognitive load during training. I call it brain endurance training. Which is something I did research with the Ministry of Defense in the UK, which is something that I think it could be applied to CrossFit and especially for athletes that may have reached the amount of work, physical work, that they start to get overuse injuries, and they want to increase load in some other ways without injury. I think increasing the cognitive load of training could be a way to improve performance further. Again, it's a big topic, so maybe we can discuss it next time.
That stuff's super interesting, so you should definitely do it again.
Yeah, we'll revisit it. That's why I do my designs in between my sessions. It's a little extra cognitive load.
Yeah, Ben, thanks for inviting me on, and Sam, it's a pleasure to talk with you.
I
appreciate it.
You guys, I really like your work. I follow you on YouTube.
I've learned a lot of stuff from your work, Sam, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, gentlemen, let's we'll calendar joust and we'll reconvene.
Take care, guys.
All right. Bye. See you guys. Ciao. Thank you, man. Bye.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.